Great. So I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for having me. And I'm very happy to give you a small input on the use of smartphones for data collection in the social sciences. What will the talk cover today? So first, the first part, I will look at why should we collect data with smartphones? What type of data can we collect? And what are the benefits compared to existing methods? So what's really the point of using smartphones for data collection? Second, I want to give some examples of research questions that we can address by using these new types of smartphone technologies. And finally, I will also discuss the practical issues and kind of different aspects of quality that we should consider when we collect data with smartphones. And here I want to talk about representation error. So kind of who can we get with these smartphone methods? And second, also like on measurement error. So what's the quality of the data that we would then get? Okay, so first of all, why should we collect data with smartphone? Maybe this is not a surprise or news for you that smartphones are now increasingly integrated into our everyday life. So recent numbers, for example, suggest that around 3/3 of the general population in Germany, that's people aged 15 and above, they own a smartphone. And it's not only that they own a smartphone, but they also use it heavily throughout the day. So for example, in a study that I conducted with colleagues with Florian Keusch from Mannheim and Fred Conrad from Michigan, we asked people about the extent that they use their smartphones throughout the day. And we find that more than 80% of those who own a smartphone, they say they check their smartphone everywhere. So also when they leave their home. So it's always in the same context as the people themselves. And now looking forward, there are also an increasing array of activities that, like digital activities that really rely on smartphones that we cannot do on other types of devices. Well, so for example, communication regarding certain types of communication apps, WhatsApp, Signal, Telegram, and so on. Smartphones become more and more important for kind of commercial activities. Often you need to have a smartphone for online banking, or if you want to engage in kind of mobile payment. In the area of mobility, smartphones become more important, for example, for buying train tickets, for buying plane tickets, for using car sharing. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen an increase in the use of smartphones, especially for this contact tracing, digital contact tracing, and also now for the use of vaccination certificates. And finally, smartphones are not only a device for themselves, but they're also a hub for kind of connecting to other electronic devices and especially to what is called the Internet of Things devices. So kind of smart home applications that often require a smartphone to kind of transmit data or to connect data with. So now while smartphones are so heavily used in everyday life, they are also increasingly popular in the social sciences as a tool for data collection. And here we can distinguish really between, on the one hand, using smartphones to administer web surveys, traditional web surveys, but then also collect new types of data from these smartphones, for example, from the operating system or the built-in sensors. And I now want to talk about these two domains. Let's first talk about kind of using smartphones as a survey tool. So here on the right-hand side, you see a question as it is displayed on a smartphone. And when we look at surveys, also at large-scale survey programs, we see really an increase in the use of smartphones for kind of completing them. People receive invitations to the survey via an email, and since they often check their emails on a smartphone, they're likely to click on the link and immediately do the survey on the smartphone itself. So this is like kind of one area where we need to consider smartphones, or where smartphones are increasingly important. Now, a second area is also the use of smartphones to conduct diary studies. So diary studies are studies that kind of try to capture events when they occur or soon after they occur. Classical examples are, for example, diary studies on time use. So in which domains do people spend what amount of time, how much time do they spend working, commuting, leisure time, and so on. Travel diaries is another area where diaries are frequently used, and also in the area of expenditure measurement. So to collect data on the types of goods and services that people spend money on, diaries are heavily used. And so this is now increasingly moved towards smartphones. And one reason being that people are likely to carry their smartphone around with them throughout the day, so they can immediately record those events throughout the day, really. A third area where smartphones are now increasingly used is the area of experience sampling, or maybe you've heard the term ecological momentary assessment. The idea here is that, so it's basically a survey or multiple surveys, and they are prompted at random times during the day. This could be also regular intervals. So these surveys are prompted every evening at the same time, or based on certain events that happen. And they're often conducted in psychology, for example, to measure the subjective well-being that individuals have at this very moment in time. And so again, here smartphones are quite convenient, since people always have their device with them throughout the day. And also we can use those features of smartphones, such as sending notifications, push notifications, with the through apps that kind of help with these types of data collection. I already talked about some of the potential benefits of using smartphones for surveys. So one of these benefits is that we can conduct really an in situ measurement of attitudes and or behaviors, which means kind of this is really in the moment data collection. The advantage here is that recall error can be reduced if respondents, for example, complete a diary about certain events, like they record like which trips they had made during a day, really close in time to the event, and they don't wait for it until the alternative might be a paper diary that individuals complete, and here they might just complete the diary at the end of the day. A second advantage of this kind of in the moment measurement is that we can collect much more detailed information from respondents, because we ask them kind of in the moment. And so it's of course much easier to ask somebody, for example, about details of certain trips they had made during the last hour, than to ask about these details over a longer time frame. Now, a second advantage of using smartphones for these types of surveys is that we can actually implement a longitudinal research design. So we can really observe change over time. For example, when we look at those experience sampling studies, we repeatedly invite the same people to, for example, to report about their subjective well-being at random times during the week, during the day. And we can use those features of smartphones, such as sending notification, to kind of remind participants to complete the survey, and to kind of to increase compliance over time. How do we collect data with smartphones? And especially like kind of survey data with smartphones. So first of all, those browser-based smartphone surveys can be easily programmed with the common web survey software that you might be familiar with. For example, this includes Qualtrics or Unipark, Questback, that really allow to design questionnaires for smartphones. And you can also, if you only want to conduct a smartphone survey, you can also filter based on device type. So only your questionnaire will be sent out to people who complete it on a smartphone. Now, if you want to use survey apps, or if you want to implement those experience sampling studies, there's additional software available, both commercial and open source software. So here I listed two kind of projects. One is Samply, I think by the University of Constance. That's an open source project that allows to implement those experience sampling studies that kind of trigger surveys at random times throughout the day, for example. And the second project, that's a company, Momentary, that also allows to kind of design survey apps or and/or implement those experience sampling studies. So really, depending on what kind of data you want to collect, what kind of survey data, you can choose between different software options. Let me briefly talk about kind of like things to consider when we want to design questionnaires for smartphones. This could be a separate input talk in the Social Science Data Lab on kind of how to design questionnaires for smartphones. But this is just like a kind of, some I think 5 key points to consider. So first of all, readability is key. So the text, I mean, smartphones have a relatively small screen. Now the newer generations of smartphones, the screen size has increased over time, but still the text is much smaller compared to a PC or laptop. And so the text, if you want to conduct a smartphone survey, the text should be large enough to really promote easy reading. And this also, so this kind of large enough also applies to the different targets that we have in the survey. So for example, radio buttons, drop-down menus, things to navigate the questionnaire. These targets should be easy to select and to tap accurately so that we don't make any mistakes, so that our respondents don't make any mistakes when going through the survey. Another principle is like visibility should be present across the page. So all content should ideally fit the screen width, and we should not scroll horizontally. Respondents are used to scroll vertically, so that's something that we can do. But if possible, it would be good to kind of keep it everything it would be good to really avoid this horizontal scrolling. Another principle is to kind of keep things simple. So with this web survey design software, we can implement sliders, we can implement really complex types of survey questions. If we want to implement this survey on smartphones, maybe it's better to use less than more to kind of avoid any complications that people might have on the small screen. And finally, what's key with smartphone questionnaires is that the display of the survey of the questionnaire should be predictable across devices. So it won't be the same because people use different people have different operating systems, Android, Apple. People have different types of browsers that they complete the survey on. But what's key is that we can know kind of how things will look like on the different devices. Okay, so this was a brief overview of kind of where a smartphone used in the context for survey data collection. Let me now move to the second area on where we can use smartphones. That's to collect data from the operating system and from the built-in sensors. On this graph, you can see how sensors have evolved over time. This is, as an example, the Samsung Galaxy smartphone. And as you can see here, from 2010 to 2020, the amount of sensors available has really increased over time. Let me just briefly show you a few of these sensors that can be used to collect data in the social sciences. So first of all, we can, of course, track the activities that individuals do on their smartphone. So kind of track the smartphone behavior that they do. And how this works, that's through operating system log files that are automatically generated by the operating system and that we can draw upon. What we, for example, can collect data on includes the number of phone calls that people make, the number of text messages they receive, the types of apps they use, and the amount of time, for example, that they use these apps, or the amount of time that they call different people. And finally, smartphones allow tracking kind of the internet browsing behavior that people do within the mobile browser. Generally, we collect really information about the type of the activity, about the time that these activities are done, and usually not really information about the content. For example, not about the content of the call, but just kind of about the number of calls made during a certain time period. What actually can be recorded on a smartphone really depends on the operating system that people use. And here, iOS is much more restrictive than Android. So on iOS, we can collect much fewer information than what's possible on Android. And second, of course, individuals might restrict the type of information that they want to have tracked through the user settings. So that's highly variable. And using these measures of kind of the number of phone calls they do, the number of text messages they write, and so we can, for example, measure the amount of social interactions that people have, or the size of their social network that they're engaged in. And I mean, directly tracking the app use behavior or internet browsing behavior also gives us insight about kind of the amount and also the variety of kind of web content that individuals engage in. So this is kind of a first key area where smartphones are now increasingly used. The second area is to track the location and the movement of users who carry their smartphone around. And this works through actually various sensors. So one, maybe the most prominent, is through GPS. So how this works is that through GPS sensor, coordinates are captured based on a distance to at least 4 satellites. This can be more. This would give us the coordinates in latitude and longitude. For example, I looked up the University of Mannheim would have these latitude and longitude measures. GPS used to be quite inaccurate in the past, but actually the newest generation of kind of the GPS system really allows a fine-grained accuracy within 30 centimeters. So we can be quite precise in kind of where people are and how people move in the physical space. What's important here, GPS tracking, of course, works without cell connection. So we might have different areas in the city, on the countryside, where we have limited cell connectivity, but we can still rely on the GPS sensor. On the other hand, GPS performs worse in the so-called urban canyons, so kind of in streets where you have skyscrapers around, like in the cities. It performs worse indoors, and it performs also worse if you're underground. For example, if you're in the subway, it's quite difficult to track location and movement of users. What we should also note when we think about GPS sensors is that constant GPS tracking is quite battery draining. Maybe you notice this yourself when you keep using your smartphone, like for example, for Google Maps throughout some time period. It will really quickly drain your battery. And so this is something to keep in mind when we do those GPS studies, because if we constantly track people's geolocation, this will drain their battery, and they are less likely to stick to the study. Maybe they say, okay, I want to deinstall the app if it's so if it's so inconvenient, if it drains my battery so much. And so an alternative might be kind of not to track the GPS location constantly, but really kind of just in different points in time. Now, a second sensor, a second way of tracking the location or movement of people's smartphones, that's through the cellular network. And here, how this works, this is based on radio signals that are kind of transmitted between the smartphone and one or several cell towers. And what the advantage here is that it has a relatively high accuracy in urban areas. So really where the GPS maybe fails, when we have problems with these urban canyons, for example, relying on the cellular network might be an alternative option. And finally, a third way of tracking people's location or movement is actually through Wi-Fi. So whenever the smartphone looks for available Wi-Fi access points that are nearby, we can actually infer people's location. And again, this overcomes problems of urban canyons. If, for example, somebody is walking down a street between skyscrapers, but there are kind of Wi-Fi access points in those buildings, we can still infer their location. And also for indoor tracking, this kind of Wi-Fi tracking is the solution, is the most commonly used solution. Now, these technologies are not only used in isolation, but what it's also done is like you use a combination of those. So for example, you might rely on GPS tracking. If there's no GPS signal, you would rely on one or on both of the other alternative sources to identify somebody's location. Okay, this was a second kind of key area where now smartphones are used. A third one is actually to track the physical activity of users, and that's done again through a variety of sensors. So first of all, you can track people's physical activity through their accelerometer that's built into the smartphone. And what this kind of sensor does, it measures acceleration on 3 axes. On the right-hand side, you see an image. You can really kind of measure in which way the smartphone is moved, and also about the extent that the smartphone is moved. By relying on the sensor, you can really track how active are people, how much is the device carried around, and kind of infer people's physical activity. The accelerometer is again not used by its own. You also have a gyroscope, which basically measures if the device is tilted and kind of the way the device is tilted. You have a compass, or kind of what's called a magnetometer. That's input, so you can also kind of infer the direction that somebody is moving. Some smartphones also have a barometer in them. So in there you can really track changes in elevation where people are. So physical activity is a third kind of area where smartphones are used. Smartphones can be also used to measure proximity. And that's interesting. For example, if we want to measure how close are people in a crowd, this is done, for example, on research conferences to see who's speaking with whom, what's the social network, and how this works. This proximity measurement, that's often done through Bluetooth. Maybe now you know for the contact tracing app, for example, the Corona Warn app in Germany. That also works actually through Bluetooth, through a version of Bluetooth. And so what is Bluetooth? That's a short range communication between devices that works up to 30 meters. So people cannot be too far away, but still, I mean, quite some distance. And this can be done, first of all, to connect to other devices. Of course, Bluetooth has to be enabled on these devices to speak with each other. Bluetooth can be also used to connect to small transmitters, what is known as beacons. So these are kind of small tags that you could put at different places. So for example, here you can see an image of a train station. If there was a beacon installed on one of the tracks, as an example, you could kind of measure how close are people to that track, or how close are people in to different places in the train station. And the third way to use Bluetooth for data collection is also to connect again to other devices. I mentioned in the beginning those Internet of Things devices. So for example, if you have a smart scale, you want to connect your smartphone to those devices, that would also work through Bluetooth. Okay, so proximity might be another variable or might be another behavior that we can track. And finally, we can measure sleep. And that works again through a combination through sensors. So first of all, you have a microphone installed, implemented in the smartphone. And so this microphone can measure ambient noise. How loud is it in the room? Is there any background noise? Are there any conversations? Depending on kind of, I mean, of course, you could actually track what are the conversations, what's the content of these conversations. But what is usually done is that certain classifiers are trained to determine whether the participant is in a noisy or in a silent environment. And so this would be a binary 0-1 variable or some kind of magnitude, but we would not be able to reconstruct the content of the recording to kind of collect these data in a really privacy preserving context. And well, the microphone, that's often not sufficient, like kind of the noise collected through the microphone. To infer sleep, you would also rely on the light sensor that would basically just measure, is there any light around the smartphone, or is it in a dark room? You would rely again on the accelerometer. Is the smartphone kind of moving, or is it kind of still for like a longer period of time? And finally, you would rely on operating system log files to really measure, for which period has the smartphone been used, or maybe it hasn't been used for quite a while. And so using combination of these four sensors, people have trained algorithms to determine whether somebody is sleeping or whether somebody is not sleeping. Okay, so this was a small overview about the types of sensors available in smartphones, and also the types of behaviors that we can track with these sensors. But I mean, of course, the question arises: what are really the benefits compared to alternative methods to kind of infer physical activity or to measure mobility? I mean, we have surveys that measure travel behavior. We have surveys that measure physical activity, right, by mainly asking people to self-report. And well, here the main advantage is really this passive measurement of the behaviors. So we do not rely on self-reports, and therefore we can really reduce or even eliminate recall error. If we ask people to, for example, self-report about the types of physical activity they've done in a certain period, they might not really remember. But here, of course, we can directly track the amount of physical activity they engage in. A second concern that we have in surveys that we can kind of reduce with this passive tracking of behaviors is that of social desirability. So if we ask people to self-report, again, for example, the amount of physical activity they've engaged in during, or like during the past week, as an example, they might be reluctant to report that they have not done any physical activity, that they were just sitting around all day, but that they don't do any sports. And so kind of directly tracking that kind of avoids or kind of reduces these potential errors due to social desirability. The third advantage of this passive tracking is that we could potentially get more accurate data from about these behaviors. But of course, that's not always the case. And there are also potential measurement errors, measurement problems that I will talk about later today. Now, in addition to this passive measurement and the advantages of kind of doing no self-reports, but directly tracking behavior, we can also collect more detailed data with these types of data collection. So first of all, we can collect data at a much higher frequency to what would be possible in kind of surveys or self-reports. For example, if we want to measure physical activity and we want to rely on this accelerometer that measures kind of acceleration on different axes, this is often measured at a frequency of 60 hertz. So that means 60 measurements per second. And that's a quite detailed data, of course, that we would get. We would not be able to ask people at this level of detail. We could get information that cannot really be self-reported. So for example, we could infer different stages of sleep that people are engaged in. This would be impossible to really ask. I mean, we could ask about the quality of sleep, for example, but we might not be able to distinguish different stages or when people actually fell asleep at which point in time. Finally, we can really combine different data formats from one device. So for example, we would get the location from somebody to kind of see, okay, in which spaces are people moving? How do their neighborhoods look like? And then we could also get data from, and I didn't mention this, this is another sensor like the camera, right? We could ask people to send us pictures of this environment. And so we could both have now the kind of the GPS coordinates of where people are, which spaces they're moving, but also kind of get some context information on how these spaces, how these neighborhoods, for example, look like. And finally, a benefit that's often cited in the literature is that individuals encounter less response burden with these types of data collection. And I mean, that's true. Respondents have to answer fewer survey questions. They maybe just have to install a certain app on their phone once, and then it would passively track in the background their, for example, their smartphone behavior or their location. But on the other hand, participants also encounter other types of burden, of course, right? They have to maybe remember to keep the app turned on, or kind of they need to comply to our study throughout maybe a longer period of time. Many of these smartphone studies are conducted, for example, over the period of 1 week, 2 weeks. It's not just a survey that they do at one moment in time, but it's really like kind of a longer time period. And of course, a question of kind of consent, privacy, also arises. I will also talk more about this later. Okay, how do we collect those different types of sensor data? So one strategy might be to develop your own app, and this would be a way if you really want to have full control about the type of data that you want to get, and you have really a clear idea of which sensors, for example, you want to rely on. Both Android and Apple, they have this research infrastructure that kind of allows, this kind of app development infrastructure that allows to design research apps fairly easily. Although developing your own app, that's of course still very, very labor intensive. First of all, you have to set this up. This is very laborious. But then also, once an app is available, this has to be maintained. For example, if a new like a new version of the operating system comes out, this has to be maintained. Also, the question arises: if you develop your app, do you just develop it for Android? Do you just develop it for Apple? And you might introduce additional selectivities in your data. So this would be the most labor intensive and also maybe more costly option. A second option, maybe more realistic option, is to use existing data collection apps that are available. And here I just want to mention two of them. One is again this company called Mumuras, and the second this is a German company, and the second is, I think it's a Canadian company, Ethica Data, and they allow to track a range of sensor data, although they're not as extensive as maybe you need in your studies. So the types of behavior that they track is often the smartphone behavior. So for example, the number of apps you use, how long you use those apps, how many calls you receive. They also track the location of participants. Physical activity is commonly measured, and also the proximity. You could, like between people, you could also measure. But for example, there's no module to really measure sleep with these existing data collection apps. A final option, if you do not want to rely on apps, is to use JavaScript-based tools. So that's code based on JavaScript that you would implement on maybe in your web survey or on a web page. Examples here are packages developed by Jan-Karim Höhne and colleagues, who, for example, allow to track the physical activity of web survey respondents. And so that's the program called Survey Motion. Or they would allow to track voice answers in a web survey. That's a survey voice module. The advantage here is that people don't have to install a dedicated app, but you could just run the script in the background. The disadvantage is that people have to have their web browser open to be able to track the data. So as you can see, there, it really depends on the type of data that you want to conduct in your study, for which kind of tool that you might want to use. And there's really a lot of things already out there. Okay, so now I talked about the different types of sensors available and about advantages of using that, but what kind of research questions can we answer with these sensor data? So first of all, we can, of course, answer methodological research questions. And here it's, we need to collect data through both, for example, surveys and sensors, so that we can kind of validate the two sources. And here we could use the data, for example, to source one, to verify one source against the other. So, for example, there have been studies on travel apps to track mobility behavior, where respondents were asked to manually check and edit the locations and also the mode of transportation that was captured by the app, that was automatically captured by the app. And so that kind of, as a kind of, validation check to improve data quality. You can also use it the other way around. You can use, for example, this has been used in a study on internet use. You can also validate self-reported internet use through this passively collected data. So, for example, here through passively collected internet use about the amount of use or the types of internet use. A second methodological area where especially the combination of sensor and survey data is helpful is where one source provides context for the other. So, for example, you could run a passive data collection app that captures mobility or kind of the types of trips that people make. And then once a trip is automatically detected, you could ask about the reasons for why somebody made the trip, or actually provide some more information about this trip. So, for example, which kind of mode of transportation was used for this trip, which might not be inferred through the data. This could again be done the other way around. So, for example, in this study by McKieran and Murato, the authors conducted an ecological momentary assessment study. So they kind of randomly asked people to different times during a day, during a week, about their happiness, about their subjective well-being. And here they contextualized this information through information collected from the GPS location. And they kind of wanted to find out whether people are happier in natural environments as opposed to kind of more urban environments. So yeah, so kind of using the combination of those two data sources really helps to provide context for one or the other. Of course, you can kind of correlate self-reported data with sensor data as a kind of research question. So for example, you could look at whether self-reported stress really correlates with passively measured sleep, for example, the amount of sleep, the duration of sleep. And finally, you could use especially the sensor data to trigger survey question. So for example, here, a study has been conducted among unemployed people in Germany. And there was a geofence or multiple geofences installed around job centers. And whenever respondents would enter this geofence and then exit this geofence, they would get survey questions about, assuming that they went to a job center, and the survey would ask about how they liked the consultation meeting with a kind of employment officer at this job center. Or for example, studies have looked at the passively tracked smartphone behavior. So for example, whether you received a call from a certain phone number, from a new phone number, this would trigger certain questions about the call, who this person was, what was the relationship with that person, and so on. So kind of triggering survey questions based on passively collected data is one area where a lot of research is now conducted. And finally, in addition to the methodological research questions, you have a bunch of substantive research questions, of course, that can be addressed with sensor data and the combination of sensor and survey data. I mentioned the study of unemployed people in Germany. That was the IRB SMART study conducted by the Institute for Employment Research in Germany. And here the main question was, how does unemployment affect people's everyday life? Basically, does it affect their mobility behavior? Do people spend more time at home? How does it affect their kind of social interactions? And so on. Another prominent study has looked at people who were recently released from prison. And so basically, how do people find work after prison? By tracking their, by actually giving them a smartphone, and then, for example, tracking their mobility patterns, their physical activity, and also their kind of social networks. How does the sociability of students change over the course of an academic term has been looked at. So again, here the authors looked a lot at the number, the amount, and the type of social interactions made through the smartphone with their peers, and how that changed, for example, during exam time or at the beginning of the term. To what extent do social connections influence health and mental well-being? And you see a lot of these studies have looked actually at kind of the subjective well-being through a combination of sensor data and using those ecological momentary assessment or experience sampling methods. So for example, here also, what's the relationship between physical activity and happiness? And finally, sensors have also been used to study actually expenditure data through the use of the camera and through the scanning of shopping receipts that people receive from their purchases of goods and services. And so basically answering the question, how much do people spend on different types of products by using sensor data. So I now talked about the advantages of using smartphones for data collection. But I want to finally talk about the kind of quality aspects that we need to consider when we collect data through smartphones. And here I want to talk in particular about representation, whether those smartphone studies can be representative of like a broader population, of the general population, and what are potential problems. But then also in terms of measurement error. So kind of what's the accuracy of the data that we would get. So in terms of representation error, I should say that most previous research actually was based on volunteer samples, on really highly self-selected samples. So for example, one highly cited study by Wang et al. In 2014, they relied on 48 students. And now it's both the sample size that's relatively small, but also the type of sample that this, or the type of participants that we use in these studies is quite self-selectable. There have been a few efforts to scale this app-based data collection to general population samples. And so one study was this study of unemployed people that I just mentioned, conducted in Germany. They actually invited people of this of a household panel conducted in Germany, and found that only around 16% of those invited to this smartphone study took part in the smartphone study. I also mentioned this study on the use of smartphones to collect data on spending, on expenditures. That was as part of a spending study conducted in the UK. And here, this was also done on a general population sample in the UK. And here also the participation rates are fairly low, of like kind of lower two-digit numbers, like 13 percentages. There are multiple barriers, of course, that prevent individuals from participating in smartphone-based studies that we need to take into account. First of all, people might have limited smartphone access. Not everybody has a smartphone. A second factor that might play a role is actually skills. Not everybody might be sufficiently skilled to use a smartphone for certain tasks on their smartphone. A lot of these, tasks are actually passive that I showed you. For example, well, GPS tracking, that's happening in the background, right? The respondent doesn't have to do anything actively, but of course they need to set the research app up, right? And they have to install the app in the first place. They maybe have to grant some permissions to the app. And so this has to be done in the first place. And there might be individuals who will actually lack the skills of doing so. And finally, not everybody is willing to use the smartphone for data collection for various reasons. I want to briefly look at those points. So first of all, in terms of smartphone access, I showed you in the beginning of this talk that kind of recent numbers suggest that around 76% of people aged 15 and older in Germany now own a smartphone. But what we can see that this is not randomly distributed in the general population, but smartphone ownership really strongly correlates with age. On the right-hand side, you see a graph on smartphone ownership by age group from a recent study by Florian Keusch. And here you can see that like among the young age groups, like 15 to 19 or 20 to 25, more than 90%, actually more than 95% of individuals own and use a smartphone. But the more we move to the right and the more we look at older age groups, the more the rate of smartphone ownership actually drops. And so kind of age is a big component here. In addition, we also still see that smartphone ownership highly correlates with educational attainment. And with higher education, people being less likely to own a smartphone with lower levels of educational attainment. And also household income is still a factor. So if we want to conduct studies that are really representative of the general population, including different age groups, including different levels of education attainment, different levels of household income. We need to be mindful of these potential differences, of these potential coverage differences. One strategy that we can use to reduce potential biases in our data is, of course, to use weighting that can reduce some of the biases, but it cannot completely eliminate those biases. Now, a second issue that I talked about is limited willingness. And this graph is from a study that I conducted with colleagues in the UK, where we looked at the willingness that people have to use their smartphone for different types of activities or to share different types of sensor data. Here we can see that willingness really varies by the type of data collected. So, for example, on the top of this graph, you can see those types of activities or those types of sensors that have a fairly high high willingness rates. That includes sending photos through the smartphone camera, or actually allowing the smartphone accelerometer to track physical activity, or to complete a web survey on a smartphone. And so these are all tasks that are fairly active, especially kind of taking a photo for a survey or completing a survey. At the bottom of this graph, you can see sensors or activities that are that have fairly low willingness rates. And here, GPS tracking is one example, and also this kind of like installing a tracking app that would track smartphone behavior have fairly low willingness rates. And I mean, these are studies that where things happen in the background, where people might have less control over the type of data that are actually collected. And so again, here we need to be mindful of those differences when we want to implement the different types of sensors, or if we want to collect data through the different types of sensors. But of course, it's hard to it's hard to increase people's willingness by changing the sensor, right? If we want to track people's physical activity, we might need to rely on the accelerometer. Or if we want to track people's movement in the physical space, we might need to track the GPS. But still, previous research has found that there are a couple of things that we could actually influence to increase willingness, or kind of key correlates of willingness. And here we could distinguish between characteristics on the respondent side, so which attitudes or kind of behaviors of respondents predict individuals' willingness to use smartphones for research. And on the other hand, which kind of study characteristics might play a role. And so first, in terms of respondent characteristics, we clearly see that the higher the privacy and security concerns that people have towards using smartphones for research, the lower their willingness on average to engage with the different types of sensor data collection. Trust plays a key role. So the more trust that individuals have in a data collection agency, the more willing they are to participate in smartphone-based research. Here we typically see higher willingness for research conducted by universities, as opposed to research conducted by private companies or market research companies. And finally, a key correlate is also smartphone experience or smartphone skills. The higher the experience with smartphones, the more willing people are to actually use a smartphone also for data collection. Now, in terms of the for these respondent characteristics, it's maybe difficult to really modify that, because I mean, this might be more or less fixed characteristics or fixed traits that individuals have. For example, just generally their level of trust or mistrust in certain data collection agencies. But we could change some features of the study actually to increase maybe individuals' willingness. And so one is to maybe give individuals more control over the data collection. For example, studies have experimented with giving participants the option to pause the data collection for certain periods of time, that they do not want, for example, their location to be tracked, or that they do not want their smartphone behavior to be tracked. An alternative way of giving control is actually to allow respondents to review their data, or kind of to show them a brief summary about the type of data that were collected, and let them kind of edit or kind of review the data and decide what type of data they want to actually transmit to the researcher. Now, by giving more control and by allowing respondents, for example, to pause data collection or to review the data, we run, of course, into additional problems, right? In terms of we would get higher missing data if people pause the data collection, and also they might be likely to pause the data collection at certain points in time when they visit certain locations that they do not want the researchers to see, as an example. So additional biases might be introduced, of course, through these methods. And research is still quite early in this regard. A second kind of style characteristics that people have looked at is the type of invitation. So how do you invite people to your smartphone study? And what we see here is that if we invite individuals within a face-to-face interview to take part in a smartphone study, this can really boost participation rates compared to just sending them, for example, a letter, or just sending them an email with a link to the study. Here, like if we have this face-to-face setting, an interviewer might be able to help respondents with setting up the data collection, or kind of install the app and so on. Now, of course, this is not something that can be done for like smaller research projects. That's rather something for more large-scale app studies that can afford to have a face-to-face interviewer be present. But what this maybe can tell us also is the question of how can we provide additional support to individuals like during the study invitation, like maybe can we provide them additional information on like a kind of FAQ website, or kind of additional really insights on how they can install the app. I mentioned already that privacy concerns are a key factor determining the willingness to participate in smartphone-based research. And here we see that participants have, of course, concerns about potential risks related to sensor data. And this, for example, is a concern that the data are not secure, that the data streams could be intercepted by some kind of unauthorized party when, for example, the location data are collected and transmitted to a researcher. The problem that arises here, of course, is that we have multiple data streams and by connecting these multiple data streams, this could potentially re-identify the user, right? If we could combine both, for example, location data and smartphone behavior data, this might kind of allow to get some insights about who are those individuals. And finally, there's this concern that this data would be used to kind of impact some real life things for respondents, right? Maybe this could impact whether they would get certain credits. This would impact their employment, or whether they could be insured. So it's quite key to collect data, of course, in a to collect consent from individuals that conforms to the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. And what's key here is that we should inform participants fully about the type of data that will be collected. And it's also important that people can always revoke their permission to collect data at any point in time. Maybe one principle that we can follow as researchers is that we should collect only the least data that would be necessary to answer our research question, and not to kind of make use too much of kind of the full range of sensor data that we can collect with smartphones. Another principle is maybe to also try to process the raw data on the device as much as possible. Earlier, I mentioned this example of sleep tracking, and this works by relying on the microphone. And rather than actually tracking the conversations that play in the background, what's often done is that a classifier is trained that kind of process on the device whether there is noise in the background or not. And by doing this processing early on and only kind of transmit process data to the researcher, this again might be a way to to preserve privacy or kind of and ultimately to enhance trust in these data collection efforts. Finally, I want to talk about, so this was about how representative smartphone data can be, and about potential barriers to participation in these studies. And finally, I want to talk about potential measurement error that might arise when we collect data through smartphones. So first of all, we encounter sensor-based differences or sensor-based errors that occur because we use different types of devices, different models, different brands, also different types of sensors, right? There might be different technologies implemented across the different devices. And it's really hard to say whether one device or one sensor is better than the other. It really depends on what should be measured and also under which circumstances it should be measured. And so, but this is like the first source of potential measurement error, just by the sensor itself. A second concern with smartphone-based sensor data collection is also device handling. So respondents or study participants use, of course, devices in different ways. And the measurement of different behaviors might really depend on how the device is used or how the device is worn. So for example, if individuals do not carry their device with them when they leave their home, but just leave it at home, the kind of measurement of mobility or the physical activity might be biased, because it seems that the device is stationary throughout a long period of time, although in fact the person has just forgotten the device at home and is actually moving. Another point, for example, is the question of whether people keep the device turned on throughout the day, or whether people turn off the device during certain periods of the time. For example, there are people that who always turn the device off at night when they sleep, and so tracking certain types of behaviors, or of course tracking sleep, might not be possible. It might be biased if people start to turn off the device at some point in time. Also, for example, that how the device is worn or where it is carried might play a role. For example, for measuring physical activity, it might make a difference whether we wear the device in our pockets or whether we wear it in a bag. And there might be differences, for example, between by gender, right? With, for example, women being more likely to wear a smartphone in a bag, and men having it more likely just in their pockets. Another concern with device handling is also more broadly whether participants, use the device as anticipated by the researcher, and also whether they actually comply to our study throughout the whole period. So maybe they are asked to turn on their GPS tracking for 1 week, but they notice that their battery drains very quickly, and so they start to stop allowing the GPS coordinates to be tracked. And so kind of they do not really comply to the study throughout the whole period. And that might, of course, introduce some potential problems for measurement. Of course, sensor data are maybe more precise, but and potentially more accurate, but they could also contain errors. And for example, we might think of when we look at GPS tracking, and people start to use VPN networks on their device, like a different type of location might be displayed to us as opposed to their true location where they are. And I mean, and this also applies to other types of sensors. For example, the sensors might be malfunctioning as well, and this might introduce additional errors to the data. So we might not, assume that the data collected through sensors are always perfectly accurate. Finally, a key concern that research using those sensor-based data collection methods faces is that of kind of measurement reactivity. If we track the behavior of participants over a longer period of time, they might change their behavior somehow by feeling observed. And in the literature, there's this term, the Hawthorne Effect, that describes this kind of phenomenon. So here the question really arises: to what extent will be people affected by, if for example, if we ask them to send us photos of their shopping receipts to get an insight about the expenditure that they have, they might learn kind of that they spend their money on certain types of products, and they might change their behavior. They might notice, okay, I spend so much time, I spend so much money on coffee, so I want to spend less. And this, this might be an issue. Also, the question of whether and to what extent we should provide feedback is a question. A lot of these apps provide feedback to users. So, for example, sticking to the example with those expenditures study, you have those budgeting apps that would connect, for example, to your bank account, or where you could track your expenditures, and they would immediately give you feedback about the kind of categories of where you purchase or of where you spend your money on. Like, is it food and groceries? Is it traveling? Is it dining out? And the question is really here: we as researchers, should we also provide that feedback to increase compliance, to make the app more interesting to people? They could get something out of it as well. Or should we really just try not to affect, of course, their behavior by giving them some sort of feedback? I mean, and so researchers often take the middle ground and provide feedback just at the end of the study, or kind of just showing just general study results rather than giving feedback throughout the study, since that might affect measurement. Good. I want to conclude with a few resources. So there are now some really good handbooks, book chapters on the various topics that I discussed today. So first of all, on conducting web surveys on smartphones, especially on the different types of errors that might occur in these smartphone-based studies. I can recommend a book chapter by Mick Cooper and colleagues, published in 2017. There's a fairly recent open handbook on experience sampling, published by people from the University of Leuven, that I can recommend on experience sampling. And finally, there have been some journal articles on kind of sensor-based data collection, like kind of, again, the opportunities and potential pitfalls when collecting data through smartphones, that I can recommend as a further reading. Okay, I think I now talked more than I planned, but I'm now very happy to answer your questions.
Thank you so much, Alex. This was great. So we have roughly 15 minutes of time for questions and comments from the audience. So please feel free to go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question, or write your question in the chat. Okay, while we wait for questions from the audience, maybe I can start with a question of my own. And obviously, it's about the big issue of ethics. And I understand there's informed consent. At the same time, we all know consenting can also mean that people are following monetary incentives. But leaving that aside, I was wondering if we contrast academic research using these data sources with commercial use of these data sources, what difference do you see? So would you say that the apparently big ethical issues that we're discussing here are in effect fairly meaningless because these types of data are collected anyway for people who consent to the terms of conditions of apps that may collect these data without our explicit knowledge, because let's be honest, nobody ever really reads these terms and conditions? Or would you say this is really a more comprehensive, more detailed, more private view into people's lives than what everyday app usage already collects about us? And connected to that, would you say that academic research using these data sources is in some way a corrective to for-profit commercial research using these data sources? Or would you say the two benefit from one another and go hand in hand in some way?
I think that's a really great question. And let me just start by saying that a lot of those ethical issues with smartphone data collection are not yet resolved, right? In terms of also the question of how should we actually design this informed consent process, right? So you consent, for example, when you download the app in the App Store, right? That certain sensors will be used, but then also like really to comply with GDPR, we have to ask additional questions within the app. And so this is really like a multi-stage process. But to answer your first question, I think so. From my experience, usually the type of data that private companies collect in the background, and of course it's often a black box. We really don't know what can be collected. Is more than kind of these dedicated apps collect for kind of apps that collect physical data on physical activity and so on. Also, I mean, a lot of these studies are based on self-developed apps. So researchers just kind of collect a few of these sensors. So from this perspective, I think, yeah, I think it's the private companies that still collect more data. But I think I liked your second point as in the question, do we have, so contrasting academic researchers and private companies as a and having academic researchers as a corrective, maybe. I mean, we're publicly funded entities, right? We want to do research for the public good, and the question arises, don't we also have the responsibility of kind of really making sure that we get the informed consent in a proper way, that we preserve the privacy and so on, and that we do not follow the kind of example of the private companies. And you mentioned that, right? We have those long lists of terms and conditions, and people rarely read those. I think I recently read that to actually read the Facebook terms and conditions, you would need to I think 18 minutes to really read those in detail. And so I agree that kind of maybe we should serve as a corrective for what's conducted by private companies.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Well, there's a comment in the chat box. Thank you for that, Mareike. Do we have any questions for Alexander? Okay, then I'll just throw in a second question. And let me start with an anecdote. I once read a fairly critical newspaper piece on the kind of data that you can or about the kind of contents of conversations that you can infer based on trace data alone, even if you're not tracking the content of, let's say, messages or call. And the example was something like that. A male smartphone user schedules an appointment with a urologist. The GPS tells you they go to their practice, and a couple of days later, the user gets a call from them. They frantically try to reach their friends and family, after which they schedule an appointment with an oncologist. And in the months following that, you see the person spending 7 days at a local hospital using the GPS information, and then returning to the same hospital for every other month. So without knowing any of the contents, the people probably had their testicles or prostate checked, was diagnosed with cancer, and is now receiving continuous treatment. And if you add the accelerometer data to that, you probably know something about the progress of their physical recovery on top of that. Now, this is a qualitative reading of what you can infer just from trace data without knowing anything about the content. And obviously, this is a very personal health-related example, but you could apply this to other substantive things as well. The question that I have is, are there any automated approaches that try to use these sort of circumstantial trace data to predict contents of conversations or the motivation of certain activities? So is there anything that is automated, probably assisted by machine learning algorithms, that allows us to predict certain attitudes or behavior from trace data alone?
I think that was a great example for showing really how the context of the data really matters, right? Or kind of bringing together the different pieces can again show us something new, right? I think I had this point on one of the slides that multiple data streams. So you might have an anonymous user, but if you bring these pieces together, you might know, okay, that's this person. Also, you have maybe information about the city, certain times, certain doctor that they went to, and so on. One study actually that comes to my mind that was published fairly recently by people from the University of Munich and colleagues. They actually try to predict people's personality based on those digital trace data from a smartphone. So, the obvious thing might be the more calls you have, the more extroverted you are. But then also kind of all the other types of the big data personality scale. So that's actually one example for kind of inferring those. And I'm sure there are many more of these that now, and as you said, right, with machine learning to try to predict really other things that were not intended to be measured in the first place.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Okay. If we don't have any more questions, I think we can wrap this up. Thanks to our audience for being here today. Thank you, Alex, for giving this talk and agreeing to give this talk on such short notice. And the Social Science Data Lab will be back on May 4th, where we will have a talk by Andreas Küpfer on the collection, management, and analysis of Twitter data using the Twitter Research Track API. So thanks, everyone, and we will see you soon.